Good evening and welcome to The Globe on SABC News, coming to you from Johannesburg. I'm Simpio Ngongwane.
A very good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I'm Lulu Gabu. On to our top story. Nigeria's parliament is on lockdown tonight after protesters tried to storm the building. Police say 2 officers were shot and wounded during clashes with members of the Islamic Movement of Nigeria.
At least 40 protesters are under arrest. Police fired tear gas at protesters who went on the rampage earlier today. But the demonstrators are accusing the police of using excessive force.
They say officers fired live ammunition, killing 2 protesters during the peaceful protest. The Islamic Movement of Nigeria stages regular protests outside the National Assembly, calling for the release of their leader Ibrahim El-Zakzaky. He's been in detention since 2015. Human rights groups say Nigerian security forces have killed 400 members of the group in response to largely peaceful protests since 2015.
For more on this developing story, let's take you to Nigeria now. We're joined via Skype by our correspondent Phil Ihaza in Abuja. A very good evening to you, Phil. Thank you so much for joining us. What's the mood like in Abuja tonight?
Well, thank you. The mood is back to normalcy. Earlier on in the day, we had reports of protests by followers or members of the Islamic Movement of Nigeria. A Muslim minority in Nigeria, the Shiites. There's the Muslim majority called who are the Sunnis. But their protesters have been protesting, and demanding for the release of their leader, Ibrahim El-Zakzaky, who has been in detention since 2015 when the protesters clashed at that time with military or members of the Nigerian army. So they protested at the National Assembly, which, according to the police report by the FCT Command Police spokesperson, Anjuguri Manza, he said that 2 policemen were shot and 7 others were injured by stones and clubs that were thrown by the protesters, but they are currently receiving treatment. He's also said that 40 protesters have been arrested and they will face the arm of the law. He's assured citizens to go back to their normal duties, and normalcy has been restored to the city.
Well, police and protesters are now blaming each other for today's clashes, and some of the protesters say that the police fired first, and the police themselves saying that they were actually they're responding to those shots fired by the protesters. So who fired shots first? Who was responsible for this?
Well, for now, it will be difficult to know who exactly fired the shots because investigations are still on. But several social media, pictures and videos have been emanating about what must have occurred. There are also pictures of, some of the protesters severely injured. In fact, there was a picture circulating in the media of one of the protesters shot and, died on the spot. They were actually trying to revive the person, but it was a picture, so it's difficult to say. So the protesters also were supposed to, or the movement, they were supposed to give a statement, but it's been difficult because they've not been able to assemble at a particular location to give the formal statement of what exactly must have transpired. So we're keeping tabs on them, to hear their own side of the story. But so far, the police statement, so far on the official statement rather by the police, is that 2 policemen were shot by the protesters, 7 other policemen were injured by the protesters as well through clubs and stones that were thrown at them.
Let's talk about the Islamic Movement of Nigeria. I understand that they've been staging protests outside the parliament for quite some time now. Is there any feedback from the authorities with regards to their concerns of releasing their leader, Zakzaky?
Well, so far we know that at several times since 2015 there's been a series of court cases about this issue. In fact, there's been other cases where bail has been granted to the leader of the movement, but then at every point that the bail is granted, he's rearranged and detained for some other kinds of allegations or crimes. looking at obstruction of peace in the society, unlawful assembly by his members, as well as culpable homicide. And so, some analysts are saying that the prolonged detention of the leader is also part of the reasons why these protests are actually aggravating. The members are gradually losing patience, and they are increasing, their number of protests or frequency of protests at sensitive quarters like the National Assembly, the city center, some hotspots that would attract attention to remind the government, to try to adhere to what the court or the judgment of the court has given.
Do we know at this point why Sheikh Zakzaki was arrested and whether he's been convicted yet?
Sorry, I didn't get that. Say that again.
Do we know why Sheikh Zakzaki was arrested and whether he's been convicted of any offense yet?
Okay, so far there's no judgment as to his conviction yet. Like I said, the case is still in court. In fact, there was a recent sitting sometime in March, and it was adjourned again. So there's the case is still in court, talking about his conviction. But the case, dates back to 2015 when there was a clash with his protesters, now the Islamic Movement protesters, and the military, where there was an alleged roadblock which prevented the military to gain access through their location where they reside, and then the military had to force their way through that area. Some members were killed or allegedly killed in that clash, and since then, in fact, the leader and his wife were taken into custody for obstructing the movement of the military at the time. And it's been since 2015 till now, it's been 4 years since that case has been on. No one has been tried yet in terms of the military for whatever lives that were lost. The military says 7 lives were lost, but the protesters said over 300 of their members were killed in that process. So the case is still in court, but the protesters are demanding that they release their leader, basically on held grounds that he's been there detained unlawfully. They're saying he's been detained unlawfully for 4 years, and they want his immediate release.
Well, the Islamic Movement of Nigeria, it was formed in the 1980s, I understand, is the main Shia group led by Sheikh Zakzaki. And we understand that Boko Haram has condemned the Shias as heretics who should be killed. So what's the status of the IMN in Nigeria? Is it a grouping that has been classified as a militant group?
Well, they have not been classified as a militant group, and that's because most of their protests has been peaceful, but very, very active. So also we know that they're a minority in the Muslim population in Nigeria. They're linked to the Shiites, which emanates from, if you look at the population of the Shiites, are mostly drawn from Iran, and then the Sunnis, they're mostly drawn from Saudi Arabia and a host of other major northern countries in the world. So, but in Nigeria, their population, like you said rightly, they started in 1980 by Ibrahim El-Zakzaki, who is an outspoken Islamist as well. So Islamist leader, and they are also one of their agenda is to create an Islamic state for themselves, where so sometimes in Nigeria for now they've not been regarded as terrorists because they haven't, of course, crossed the line to take weapons and kill people unlawfully. So but for now they're demanding actively for the release of their leader, and until then we don't know how far their patience can hold. Like I said earlier on, security analysts are saying that it might be a matter of national urgency for the government to look into this and either release the leader or find a better way to address this issue, so we don't have this prolonged protest going on.
All right, Phil, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. That was our correspondent, Phil Ihaza, joining us live from Abuja in Nigeria.